the first Mishnah of the first parak of Pirkei Avot. Here we go. Moshe kibel Torah Sinai. Moshe received the Torah from Sinai. Usara liYoshua, v'Yoshua liskenim, uskenim linviim, unviim esarua le'anshe knesset hagadola. And he transmitted it to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. They said three things. Hevumetunim badin, be deliberate in judgment, v'ha'amidu talmidim harbeh, and raise up many disciples, v'asu siag laTorah, and make a fence for the Torah. Those are the three things. And we'll focus on maybe one or two comments. Namely, so first, why this grandiose opening? Moshe, Kibul Torah Sinai. We have this whole transmission of the Torah from Moshe at Sinai until the Anshe Knesset Kadola. That's 1,000 years. That's a long time. Why do we need this huge epic opening for Pirkei Avot? I mean, we don't see that in any other of the Mishnahs. Why specifically for Pirkei Avot? So the Rav, the Bartanura, and others deal with this, and that is to say, Pirkei Avot is a book filled with ethical maxims and advice, if you will, about how to refine one's character. And the worry is there's nothing particularly special necessarily about that in Judaism. Now, why? Because, as the Bartanura says, right? The wise people of the nations, right, the Goyim, have also written Svarim, like they discern from their hearts, in terms of a character refinement. Right, how a person should act and behave with their friends, right, their neighbors. Lefikach hitchel hatana b'masechta Moshe kibul Torah Sinai. That's why the Tana started this Masechta. Moshe received the Torah from Sinai. Lomar lecha shamidot ve'musarim shebezu Masechta lo badu otam chachamim mishnah milibam, to tell us that these midos, these Torah character traits, and these ethical maxims that are articulated in this Masechta, this isn't just kind of made up by our Chachamim, right? Even these were given over at Sinai, so it's linked all the way back to the ultimate source, right? To Sinai, to Kadosh Baruch Hu. That's why this Masechta needs to begin with that. Now, a person might ask, well, okay, I mean, what's so special about Pirkei Avot? Okay, I get it. It's true. The other nations of the world have, in fact, authored ethical works. But they also have laws of marriage, right? Why don't you start this with Kiddushin, right? Kiddushin, here's how you marry a woman. Okay, well, the nations of the world also have ways of marrying a woman. That is different. And the reason why that's different is because there is a specific mitzvah in the Torah to say, here's how you marry a woman. And the Gemara in Kiddushin deals with that. It starts quoting psukim, and so too with all of the other Masechtas, which are halachic in nature, right? They talk about Jewish law. So as a result, in order to justify their halachic decision, they always go back to a pasuk. And we're just going to give only 3 instances of this across 3 different Masechtas, which are in 3 different Siddharim of the Mishnah. So let's go and we'll start with Brachot, right, the very first Masechta. So at the very beginning of the 7th parak, the Mishnah says, Shlosha she'ach l'ka'achat chayavin lezamen, right? 3 people who ate as a group, they must make a zemen. Okay, so what does the Gemara say? Minohane mili. How do I know that that's true? So Amar Ravasi, Amar Kra, because the pasuk says Gadol Lashem iti uneruma moshmo yachtav, and that's quoting Tehillim. But just a few lines down, we actually get a pasuk from the Chumash. It says Rabbi Abahu Amar Mahacha Kishem Hashem Ekra Havu Godel Elokeinu. Right, we'll see that pasuk in a few weeks' time. So the point is, the Gemara in Brachot is clearly linking. It's very nice for the Mishnah to come down with a halacha, but how does it know that that's true? So the Gemara will always articulate or I shouldn't say always, but we'll regularly articulate that. The Mishnah has a halachic decision. How does it know that? What's the pasuk? Show me the source in a Chumash. Pirkei Avot is different because it doesn't necessarily have that source in a Chumash. I've heard that the Gra actually, for every Mishnah or ethical maxim, he'll actually give a source, I believe, in Tanakh. I haven't seen that inside, but I thought that was an interesting point. But then moving on, we see in Gittin as well, at the beginning of the 8th parak, the Mishnah says, Hazork get liishto v'hi betoch beta ubetoch hatzira harizumi goreshet. Right, a man who throws a divorce document to his wife, and she is inside her house or inside her backyard, roughly, she's divorced. Now the Gemara says, Menoha nemili. How does the Mishnah know that? Where does it derive its source from? So the Gemara says, the Tanu Rabbanan v'natan biyada, right? Because the pasuk says, and you should give it over into her hand. So Enli Ela Yada, Gaga Chatzer Karfir from Minaim. Okay, but the pasuk only says her hand. How do you know all these other places? Talmud Lomar, V'natan, because it says V'natan Mikol Makom. So again, the Gemara derives it specifically from a pasuk. And it doesn't let the Mishnah's halachic ruling go unchallenged. And even in Bava Kama, let's see that too. This, I believe, is in the second parak. It's on Chaf Vav Amud Aleph, and it continues on to Chaf Vav Amud Bet. So it says like this. So the Mishnah says, Adam Moed La'olam, right? A person is always forewarned. That is to say, he's always effectively liable for the damage he does. Ben Shogeg, Ben Mezid, Ben Er, Ben Yashin. Be it by mistake or on purpose, be he awake or asleep. And then on the very next daf, it says, on the very next Amud, it says, Menoha Nemili. Where does it know this? So what words in the Chumash does it tell us this? So Amar Chizkiah v'chentana de Chizkiah Amar Kra, Petza tachat potza, lechayevo al hashogeg kamezid v'la'ones karaton. So there you go. We have three different sources in three different Masechtas, which are in three different Siddharim, that all constantly point back to the fact that we need a source in a Chumash to tell us what the authority of the Tanaim are to say such things. Pirkei Avot is different because we don't have psukim to link them back, and therefore it's absolutely essential to link it back. And the fact that we got it from God. And one of the reasons why this is so important and so critical is because, as I heard from my own Rabbi Hurwitz, he said, people tread on a very dangerous line when they rely only on their own thinking to figure out their own ethics. Now, usually we get it right, correct? Now, the thing is, even, and I heard this even in law school and constitutional law, my own professor brought it up, and he said, when it comes to like what makes laws okay and right and correct. So there are two major theories. There's either natural law, right? We could just kind of figure this out. It's just a rule of nature, if you will. And the second is the fact that humans decided that this is correct. Now, just disregarding the whatever issues someone might have with natural law, the problem with the second category, right, human law, the fact that humans said that it's correct, that it means it's okay, the fact that a government passed the law means it's okay, well, you run into the problem of the Nazis. And nobody wants to deal with that because nobody is going to endorse what the Nazis did as okay. Now, the thing is, if all you're saying is, well, the fact that a government led by humans or run by humans has passed law makes it okay, you start getting to really tricky territory there. So as a result, Pirkei Avot, it links us back to a legitimate Masorah. I mean, we have it from God. That's pretty much the best that you can get. That's why Pirkei Avot must go back all the way back to Moshe at Sinai. That's the Vort. Now, the second idea that we want to articulate is actually Asu Siag LaTorah. Right, skipping all the way to the last, to the third of the three Ma'amarim that the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah would regularly say is make a fence for the Torah. Now, what is so critical about that? Why do we need to discuss this so much? So, sorry, before we go back to that, I just want to quickly articulate an idea. Again, and what makes us different, again, just going back to the idea that we have our ethics trained all the way back to Sinai, is just to quote Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, which is one of the more famous books on moral philosophy. We say he says, and he has some really great sayings. He says, "From my grandfather Verus, I learned good morals and the government of my temper. That's good to control your anger. From the reputation and remembrance of my father, modesty and a manly character. From my mother, piety and beneficence, and abstinence not only from evil deeds, but even from evil thoughts." That sounds pretty good. And further, simplicity in my way of living, far removed from the habits of the rich. I mean, this sounds pretty Jewish, no? I mean, the person should be careful with how he spends his money. He should be happy with simple things. We've spoken before, water and sleeping on the ground. That's all a person needs, right? And simple bread. That seems articulated by Marcus Aurelius as well. And so we see there are others, of course, that we see from him. From Apollonius, I learned freedom of will. Bechira! What can be more Jewish than that? From Sextus, benevolent disposition, and the idea, and gravity without affectation, right? You don't need to make a whole display of the fact that you're being serious, and to look carefully after the interests of friends, and to tolerate ignorant persons, and those who form opinions without consideration. These are really good midot. These are good midot. So what makes Judaism so special? So again, as the Bartanur himself says, we must link our tradition all the way back to the Torah, because otherwise we might just think, Marcus Aurelius, Pirkei Avot, or the Tanaim, there's no real difference. It's kind of the same thing. It is not the same thing. They are categorically different. It's good that Marcus Aurelius figured it out. It's good that the nations of the world have figured this out. However, things that might seem tricky. And just to quote again Marcus Aurelius, he says, from Apollonius, right, I learned freedom of will and undeviating steadiness of purpose. Okay, that's good. And to look to nothing else, not even for a moment, except to reason. Well, that may not necessarily be the most Jewish idea, right? Because at the end of the day, it's true. Anyone who's learned Gemara knows that the Chachamim will regularly go svara, will make sure that things make sense. However, when it comes to mankind's power of reason and a direct divine command given by the Torah, just because it doesn't make sense, doesn't mean that we're not obligated. There is a higher power here, and when a person effectively neutralizes anything except for his own reason, there really can be huge points of tension, as we see on a regular basis. I mean, look at the Supreme Court, look at any government run by people. There are upon which reasonable persons can disagree. That's a very wide gap that a person can bridge. Fine. So finally, moving on to Asu Siag La Torah, right? Make offense for the Torah. So why specifically this? What's so important about the idea of making offense for the Torah? So I'm going to skip over something Rav Bernstein said, even though it's really powerful, about the historic meaning of the Anshe Knesset HaGadol and making offenses to the Torah. And I'll just go, and we'll quote something Rav Aaron Lichtenstein says, and he's quoting the Rambam. He says, let's now further refine our understanding of the duty of Lashomra. It has not only a negative aspect, namely, that a person does not have the right to dispose of objects arbitrarily or even to deal with himself as he wishes. It also has a positive aspect. There's an obligation to be a shomer, to be a guard, to be careful, and not merely in order to avoid damage. The Rambam says, the guarding of the temple is a positive commandment. This applies even though there is no fear of enemies or bandits, for its guarding is in order to honor it. A palace with guards is not comparable to a palace without guards. Guards are stationed out of a sense of kavod for the Paltrin Shel Melech, the palace of the king. There is a sense of elevation, of nobility, of something unique that requires guarding. When a person guards the mitzvahs of the Torah, he's effectively saying this is something that's worthwhile. It's not only to avoid, chas v'shalom, violating one of the divine commandments, but it's also to make sure that we understand, this is something kavodic, this is something important. I have a special feeling for this. A person who say, well, there's an article published about him in the newspaper, and it's really amazing, or there's been a particularly noble deed that, his family has done. They want to make it special. They're not just going to bring the newspaper back and throw it on the floor. They're going to frame it. They're going to make sure it's in something that's waterproof, because there's a certain amount, there's obviously a certain amount of protection. But even if you're not worried about it at all, you just want to make sure there's a certain amount of chashivut that goes into something when you're guarding it. So that's on the most simple level. But there's something even further than that. The idea of, yes, avoiding damage. And Rabbeinu Yonah, in his Pirkei on Pirkei Avot, has something quite incredible to say. He says, in my own words, a person who makes fences shows his yira, his awe for God, his fear of God, more clearly even than someone who performs mitzvahs. And this might seem a little bit strange. How can that possibly be? A person who performs the mitzvahs. He's performing the mitzvahs. He's doing what the Torah says. And the answer, says Rabbeinu Yonah, is because he shows that by not making safeguards, he doesn't really care if he does the mitzvah or not. It doesn't really make much of a difference, because if he really did care, then he'd make a safeguard. For example, a person has a really important meeting. This is my own example. A person has an important meeting. What he's going to do, he's going to make sure, he's not going to just rely on his own memory. He's going to make sure, tell his wife, listen, please make sure that I make this, wake me up on time. He'll put a reminder in his phone. He'll put a bunch of other things to make sure that he does not miss this meeting. Or a person, say he was earning a high salary or even a low salary, right? He's just earning money. He's not just going to kind of throw his paycheck on the floor oh, whatever, hopefully I'll pick it up. He's going to make sure, if he's not going to be at home, he'll call his neighbor, hey, can you please take in the mail for me? And even legally, this can have ramifications. A person who opens a bank account, there's something called a dual-factor authentication. What that means is there are two different ways that any transaction you want to do in your bank account goes through effectively two security walls, or two security doors. The first, obviously, is username and password. That's easy. The second, though, is, let's just say I'm using a bank, right? Bank Incorporated, and I want to transfer money with it. So obviously I have to use my username and password, but that can be easily hacked. So as a result, I'll have a second thing, the dual factor, two factors. What is that? That if I want to transfer money from my bank account, then my wife needs to get pinged, and she has to go into her app and authorize it. Because in that way, it's not only if someone hacks my account, that's very likely, but for someone to hack both my account and my wife's account, and to make sure that all that stuff is going together in the proper way, is highly unlikely. And you think, that's just being a responsible person. Well, that's so correct, but that's because a person values the money he's accumulated in his bank account. And as a result, we see, and legally speaking, the reason why I mention this is because it's very possible that if a person was defrauded, right, a person's bank account was hacked and money was in fact transferred out, that person who is hacked, effectively, when the bank offered them, when you originally opened the account, hey, we have dual factor authentication, would you like to do that? And the person says, no, it's okay, I'm fine with one. He'll probably lose, because the person was being negligent. Like, listen, people know that people can get defrauded. You knew that. You chose not to do this, something that's more safe, and therefore you lose against the bank, even if the bank may have been at fault. And so we see, again, there's this idea, a person who really wants to guard something, don't be negligent, make sure that you erect fences, dual factor authentication, tell other people, frame whatever you want to do. But similarly, if there's a mitzvah from the Torah, we want to make sure to safeguard it as much as possible. That's what shows Yira, and we'll end it there. Shabbat Shalom.